By 1776, the military situation in America had reached a point where the colonists had to face a major decision. With the invasion of Canada and numerous small skirmishes, the Patriots had either to bow down quickly in submission, which would brand them as traitors and rebels, or defy British might and declare independence. This would mean full-scale war, for Britain would not willingly yield her richest colonies. Many colonists, too, would be alienated by a call for independence, for many colonists were still loyalists or Tories who wanted to remain in the British fold. But the direction seemed clear. In July of 1776, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Congress met and declared a new nation. The colonial experience had born the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence was signed here in July of 1776, and from then the United States dates its birth. Here was the end product of 10 years of turmoil and over a century of colonization. But it would be a violent birth, for now the British pursued the war with savage determination. What had been claimed with the pen must now be won with weapons. The conflict was soon joined in New York City, the most strategic location in the colonies. There, Washington's inexperienced Continental Army faced General William Howe's mixed force of British regulars and Hessian and German mercenaries. But Howe called for a truce. Lord George Germain, Lord North's overseer of the American situation, in a last-ditch effort to avert war, had instructed Howe to meet with the rebels and to try and work out a peace. General Howe called for a meeting, but it was fruitless. Now the matter had to be settled by force of arms. The British attacked Washington across Long Island and Brooklyn. From the start, Washington was outfought and outmaneuvered. His untrained troops were no match for the British, and he soon retreated from New York to White Plains, where the fighting continued. At White Plains, Washington again was tactically defeated, but again he managed to avoid complete catastrophe. The British troops, although triumphant in the field, were unable to either capture or destroy the entire Continental Army. It was a pattern of battle that would characterize many of the later revolutionary campaigns. After White Plains, Washington managed to escape south, where in the northern part of Manhattan Island and across the Hudson River in New Jersey, he built two forts, Fort Washington and Fort Lee. Here he made another stand. And again he was defeated. By sheer fortune he managed to escape into New Jersey, where the British pursued him until he crossed the Delaware River into the momentary safety of Pennsylvania. The British established a string of outposts throughout New Jersey and retired for the coming winter to New York City. Howe had won a smashing success, and Washington had suffered a humiliating series of defeats. It was a bad beginning for the new army and the new nation. Washington realized that the Patriots had been badly demoralized and needed a victory. So, in order to restore the rebels' spirits, he decided on an unorthodox and brilliant move. A night offensive in the midst of winter against the Hessian outpost at Trenton, New Jersey. On Christmas Day, 1776, Washington's troops crossed the Delaware River. The next morning, after a night of marching, he attacked the surprised Hessians. It was an overwhelming American victory. The enemy was completely routed, and American spirits soared. But the campaign wasn't over yet. As Washington learned that Lord Cornwallis, Howe's second-in-command, was approaching Trenton with a large force, he decided to slip behind the enemy lines and attack another British outpost at Princeton, New Jersey. Again, he was victorious. The battles of Princeton and Trenton had successfully destroyed the British garrison system in New Jersey and demonstrated the Continental Army's fighting ability. Washington marched his exhausted troops to Morristown, New Jersey, where he encamped for the winter of 1776-77, within striking distance of New York City. The winter campaign ended on a note of optimism and triumph. While Washington camped at Morristown, the British were hastily abandoning most of their far-flung outposts, and many of the gains Howe had made in the summer were lost. Washington's strategy now set into a pattern. He would strike whenever a target presented itself, but would avoid large-scale battles if possible. He would fight a long war of attrition. It was an innovative policy in 18th century warfare, and although it lacked the trappings of military glory, it was a wise, sensible, and necessary one. In the spring of 1777, the British renewed the offensive. Under the leadership of British Generals Burgoyne and Clinton and Colonel Barry St-Leger, they planned a three-part attack on New York State. The plan was Burgoyne's, and it was a good one. He would lead a force south from Canada. St-Leger would lead one east from the Great Lakes, and Clinton would march north up the Hudson River from New York City. All three armies would converge on Albany in the center of New York. With New York conquered, the colonies would be divided, and the British could then easily suppress the rebellion in each isolated region. But no sooner had the plan been implemented than it was beset by problems. Clinton's attack up the Hudson never materialized. General Howe in New York City was busy planning his own attack on Philadelphia and wouldn't spare the troops. Thus, one-third of the strategy was thwarted. St-Leger in the west also had his difficulties. Forced to fight at Oriskany, St-Leger, though victorious, soon grew anxious about rebel strength. His main allies, Iroquois Indians, he found untrustworthy, and believing reports of American troop size, reports started by Benedict Arnold, he retreated to the Great Lakes. Burgoyne's troops, marching through the mountain area of northern New York, were soon also having difficulties. Rebels cut down trees, diverted rivers, harassed supply trains, and ambushed details, slowing down his line of march. And Burgoyne, too, found his Indian allies a source of great trouble. The Indians scalped and murdered Janie McCrae, a Tory loyalist who was trying to visit her fiancé, a soldier in Burgoyne's army. The incident aroused the wrath of the New Yorkers and turned many Tories against the British. Hampered by the terrain, the populace, and bad propaganda, Burgoyne dispatched a large force to raid Bennington, Vermont for supplies. However, a militia force of Americans under John Stark was waiting for them. The resulting Battle of Bennington was a British catastrophe. Burgoyne, learning of the defeat and loss of a sizable part of his army, was advised to retreat. But out of stubbornness, he refused and plunged on southward, where he finally met a large American army under General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. In a series of battles fought around Saratoga, New York, Burgoyne was outfought, and he surrendered his entire army. The victory was a momentous one for the Americans. They had, in a single stroke, wiped out a whole army. Gates became a rebel idol. Further south, though, Gates' victory was being offset by continued misfortune for Washington's army. In the battles of Brandywine and Germantown in Pennsylvania, Washington suffered two major defeats. By October, Howe had occupied Philadelphia, and Congress had fled. Unavoidably, Washington's failures were compared to Gates's victory at Saratoga. And as the American army settled in for the winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge, it was a beaten, dispirited group of men. Washington had lost almost all of his supplies, and during the winter, the troops would face starvation and lack of clothing and shelter. As the bitter winter wore on, supplies were not forthcoming. Due to losses in battle, an inefficient supply system, lack of funds, and local residents' unwillingness to continue extending credit to an impoverished and beaten army. Washington's military problems were being compounded by political ones. Enemies in Congress and in the Army began campaigning for his removal, and the infamous Conway Cabal, a plot of Army officers to effect his replacement by Gates, was begun. Such a removal would have meant political disaster for the Patriot cause. But like all other storms, Washington weathered this one and retained his position. However, there were bright moments at Valley Forge. First, a large body of European soldiers joined his ranks. Men like Baron von Steuben, Lafayette, de Kalb, Pulaski, and Kosciuszko. Under their professional hands, the Army underwent diligent training in the military arts. Also, Benjamin Franklin, in Paris, effected an alliance with France and secured that nation's aid, both military and financial. It was a stunning diplomatic victory and guaranteed the Americans the resources needed to eventually win the war. Sir Henry Clinton, meanwhile, had replaced Howe as Supreme British Commander. After 2 years, Howe had had enough of the revolution. Clinton's strategy called for an evacuation of Philadelphia and a return to New York. Washington realized that the British, when marching through New Jersey, would be strung out for miles and would be vulnerable to attack. Marshaling his forces, he attacked them at Monmouth Courthouse. However, a frustrating mix-up of orders turned the supposedly easy American victory into a near defeat. Only Washington's stubborn will saved the army. The battle was a draw, and Clinton escaped to New York. But the Continental Army, encamped nearby, remained a threat to the major British base. After the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, the North quieted down, and the arena of major conflict moved south and west. The city of Savannah, Georgia, fell to a British expedition by year's end. The British decided on a new strategy. They planned to defeat the more vulnerable, less developed, and less heavily defended southern colonies. In the West, meanwhile, under George Rogers Clark, the Americans fared better. A small force managed to defeat the British in the Illinois Territory at the battles of Vincennes and Kaskaskia. Although he had lost, and later had to regain Vincennes in 1779, Clark's exploits established an American presence in the Northwestern Territory. The year 1779 saw French aid begin to pour into the American treasury, and the British public and Parliament were beginning to suffer war weariness. Charleston, South Carolina, fell to a British force in 1780 as the British were determined to bring the war to a successful conclusion. A Southern showdown was in the offing. And it came at the Battle of Camden, where Horatio Gates met British General Lord Cornwallis. The Americans were slaughtered at Camden. Cornwallis followed up his success with a vigorous offensive, and it soon appeared that the British Southern strategy would succeed. Benedict Arnold's treason and his plot to sell West Point to the British intensified growing feelings of doom. A victory was needed to raise the Patriots' spirits. It came deep in the southern backcountry. American militia crushed British-led Tories at Kings Mountain. This battle helped slow the British wave of conquests. General Nathanael Greene was sent south to stop Cornwallis. Greene enlisted American irregulars such as Francis Marion, also known as the Swamp Fox, and devised brilliant means of warfare. Splitting his troops into small, flexible, mobile forces, Greene embarked on a campaign of attrition. Although he would suffer many defeats, his strategy would eventually grind away British power and momentum. At the Battle of Cowpens in 1781, Americans under General Daniel Morgan fought what is regarded by many as the most perfect battle of the war. The victory marked a turning point in the Southern campaign. Despite victories, Cornwallis's strength was worn away, and he marched north into Virginia in pursuit of an American army led by Lafayette. Greene had won. Despite years of dazzling victories, the British had come no closer to conquering the rebels by 1781 than they had in 1776. One smashing victory was all that was needed to win American independence. Thousands of French troops under French General Rochambeau, a fortune in French money, and a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse had strengthened Washington's position as the war entered its waning months. When word reached Washington of Cornwallis's withdrawal under pressure, to the port of Yorktown, Virginia, he decided to commit his vast resources to a single great battle. Under siege, Cornwallis held on as long as he could, but the rebels were too strong and his supplies too limited. He had no choice but surrender or face slaughter. In October 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his entire command. Only Clinton's force, alone and bottled up in New York, remained as a major British presence in America. Yorktown, in effect, marked the end of the Revolution. Although the peace treaty officially ending the war wasn't signed until 1783, the war, for all practical purposes, was over, and the United States of America was a reality.